The Aptitudes tab. Moresby Online has 5 aptitudes within it, and these take about 1 hour 25 minutes out of a 1 hour 40-minute test session, so that's the bulk of the time. And I always make sure I extract as much value as I can out of this section. I talk elsewhere about the content of the tests and also what the various patterning, the lengths of the bars suggest. And they're in both the aptitudes video and the core aptitudes video. If a student sits with you and says, I can't remember what abstract meant or what is spatial, you can click on what is measured on the right and they can read the summaries there. And of course there is a full interpretation of the profile shape down the bottom. One of the things that I notice here is that on the right there is a note. Now, notes pop up when something's happened in the testing that Moresby thinks that might be worth looking at. And here it's talking about the verbal assessment being a little bit unusual in how they approach it. What do you do in a situation like that? Well, the first thing you might do is you might look at the overall pattern of the profile, which is a science technical one here, and work out whether that fits in with the interests or not. So in this case we have someone who doesn't like writing and speaking, so that fits well with not doing well on verbal. Could be interest, could be ability, could be a bit of both, but they are very strongly interested in persuading people, so it doesn't seem to be a personality thing that they don't like communicating. They just don't like words, I guess. But interestingly, they have said on the right that languages are a specialist interest. And that makes me wonder if English is a second language for them, and they just haven't told us. They might have a very straightforward, simple vocabulary, which is fine for everyday communication, but anything out of the ordinary, they just haven't got that vocabulary. So that's a possibility in my mind. To find out more, I'm going to go back to Manager, top right, and I'm going to pick up the advisor summary, so called because it's specifically aimed at advisors who've been trained and know what they're looking at. There's some technical information here that you wouldn't really want untrained people to get access to. When you're training, when you're initially learning Moresby Online, this paragraph on the right is probably the most useful section to try and make sure that you're understanding what the test score, the theory behind what the test scores are suggesting. So we're here to look at the verbal, and the first thing I look at is accuracy and attempted. So this student has got a 33% accuracy. Not very high and well below any of the other accuracies. And the verbals, there are 5 possible answers. 1 is correct, so there's a 20% chance of guessing one. And they've got 33, so it's not a wonderful score. They haven't finished the testing though, and typically when people are guessing, they click all the way through to the end. So I'm kind of wondering what's happening here. When we look at all the tests, the student hasn't got through any of them. So they've worked diligently and probably taken a long time over items. So I'm thinking possibly they put in a lot of effort, but they just work more slowly than others. But for the verbal, they sat there looking at the items and got them wrong for some reason. Could be they didn't get the content. That's possible, but it's kind of unlikely. And if that was the case, they'd probably have done better on one half of the test than the other. And I still wouldn't be expecting to see such a low accuracy rate. So I'm betting here English is second language, or they just have a very poor vocabulary. Other things we notice here are that there is a number on the end of each bar, and that comes from what we call a scale score, based on a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 4. Now, I don't want to get into the technicalities, but 10 is population average, 15 is well above. And if you look at the percentile bar below, you can see that 15 is around the 85th percentile, so this person's performed better than 84% of others in the comparison group on that test. The comparison groups are age specific, so there's a 14-year-old group, a 15-year-old group and a 16 plus group. With the 16 plus group, it doesn't matter if someone does this testing when they're 16 or 22. We wouldn't expect a 22-year-old to do any better, because by 16 the aptitudes have stabilised. If it was something based around attainment, we would expect them to do better, particularly if they've been in education. But when we're looking at underlying capacities to solve problems, that shouldn't change in that age group. The spatial test is the one exception to that. About 7% of 15-year-olds are spatially blind and just don't get the test. So you'll know that because they'll have a really short spatial bar and it will look out of context with the rest of the results. The other thing you notice here is that there is a barbell at the end of each of the bars, and that is a measure of the standard error of measurement. When we're interpreting test scores, we need to be sure that we're not over-interpreting small scores, and that's really what this is all about. So where two bars are overlapping, we're not confident that the scores are different. We may interpret it to some extent, but behind the scenes, something like abstract versus numerical, the system is thinking, well, there's a bit of difference there, but we're not statistically confident that abstract is different. It's possible that if they redid the test on another day, the scores might be the same, and it's vaguely possible, maybe a 2% chance or less, that numerical will be stronger than abstract. So we'd be cautious about putting too much weight on a level of difference where there's an overlap. But with verbal and abstract, there's no overlap, so we're 95% confident the scores are different, and unless something went wrong in the testing, that would be weighted heavily in driving the direction of the career suggestion component of the aptitudes. End of module.